Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. For those of you who aren't aware, we're going to jump into spoilers practically from the beginning of this video, so if it's been a while and you never got a chance to play the original Whisper mission and see what it's all about, and you still want to go in blind, I would highly recommend turning off now and coming back at a later date. For the rest of you, let's turn the clock back a little bit. Some of you might have heard the whispers from long ago on Io, calling you to the lost oasis. The voice of this whisper promised both the power to destroy your foes and a purpose in that destruction. Though it called us to Io and the grove of Ulan-Tan, the voice originated from another world in the system. It was the last remaining vestige of a singular darkness unlike anything we'd faced before that point. A darkness that nearly overcame us in the frozen caverns below its darkest lair. Our true tale began long ago with two figures of evil. They were known as Xol and Nokris. Xol was one of the offspring of Zeta, the Worm Mother. As one of the worm gods, this so-called Will of Thousands was powerful, and yet he was one of but 5 siblings. 5 who with the death of Akka turned to 4. Xol was one of the lesser of his siblings. Yul, the honest worm, had bargained well and grown fat with power, and he looked upon his sibling with a slathering hunger. This would be an eternal concern of Xol. Thus, Xol's thoughts perhaps turned to survival because of this brutal nature, and in turn, Xol would make his own bargains. He would find such a means of advancing his cause in a figure of great controversy within the Hive, Nokris. Nokris was the second son of Oryx, the Taken King, and though he did not hold the same fearsome strength as his better-known brother Crota, Nokris made his mind sharp to compensate. He consumed Hive Arcana of every sect and creed. He sought an advantage of any kind possible. Nothing was beyond his consideration, including Arcana that the Hive themselves would find heretical. He approached the Worm Gods with this search for power in mind and asked for their favor in a bargain. While the other worms turned away, Xol saw something of himself in this young Hive Prince. It offered a bargain with him. The power to spin life from death in exchange for his heart and servitude, his fealty, undying. Nokris would accept this bargain and gained the power of necromancy. One must understand that despite the close relationship that the Hive have with death, they see it as a sacred part of the sword logic. To defy death and learn from it as the Ascendant Hive do is permitted, for their deaths are not true. But to defy a true death, one that an Ascendant Hive would not suffer, one that a lesser being without a throne world would be subjected to, that was seen as an unholy affront to the sword logic. They had died a final death and so were considered failures in the eyes of the Swarm, unworthy of being crafted into a sharper, more final shape. By learning the skills of necromancy, Nokris was not only betraying the sword logic, but also his father. Such was the nature of his ambition, that Nokris seemingly did not care. When Oryx learned of his son's betrayal, he was enraged beyond imagining. He banished Nokris and his brood from the High War and all the domains of the Hive. But for the sins that his son had committed, this was not enough. He may have been the blood of Oryx, but Oryx still saw him as an affront to all that the Hive were, as apostasy manifest. Oryx had Nokris's name struck from all the histories of the Hive. Neither the world's grave nor his own books of sorrow would record his second son's history. There was but a single relic of his existence that remained untarnished. A statue set before the altar of Oryx, which was stubborn in its ancient Hive magics, beyond even the will of Oryx to destroy, as it was crafted into the flesh of the Dreadnought itself. But Nokris did not care. He had found a new power and a new master in the form of Xol, who, despite seeking the sword logic himself, had seen power to be gained in this bargain. a bargain that was set upon heresy and yet could still serve to sharpen blades where necessary. Together, the Worm God and the Hive Prince conspired to head to Sol during the collapse and take the planet of Mars for their own. There, they discovered the central core of Sol's greatest defender, Rasputin, the Warmind. They descended upon the core facility in Hellas Basin with swift resolve, bringing the entirety of Nokris's brood to bear in the assault. But the Warmind was more than capable of defending itself against these lesser Hive. Rasputin deployed a cryogenic weapon system that froze Nokris, his brood, and even the Worm God as they all descended upon Mars. This weapon's radius was so massive that it practically created an artificial ice cap at the location. Thus, all the players were frozen in place. The Warmind's true self, the Worm God, the Hive Prince, and his brood of unending thrall and other Hive servants. It would be many years before the ice began to thaw. The reawakening of the Traveler at the end of the Red War led to a moment of great change across the system. For the Warmind and the now frozen brood of Hive, it was the reawakening of the gods of Mars, who returned once again to rekindle their conflict. But there were others drawn to this frozen land as well. Alongside Anastasia Bray, one of the original creators of the Warmind, and Commander Zavala, the Vanguard Titan mentor, we headed to Mars, to Hellas Basin, to rediscover the old Warmind's core facility and face off against the Hive and the Worm God. By our light alone, we defeated the second son of Oryx, sending him into a retreat. In this moment, Zol took notice of us. His supplicant prince had been bested by creatures of light. It was bound to be a moment that intrigued the Worm God, even as his pervasive darkness enveloped the Guardian and suffocated them in snow and ice. Heading to Rasputin's core facility, Zol intended to end the farce once and for all. But the Guardian had returned, and using the power of the Warmind's weapons and the light's radiance, Zol was struck down. But it appears that not all of Zol died within the snowy wastes of Mars. For death is not the end. Death is a road. Death is change. And for a Worm God, beholden to the logic of the sword, for Zol, the will of thousands, death was a tiding of things to come. Disregarding his supplicant Nokris, who had failed him, Zol's spirit fled. He still held the wayward son's heart, and so Nokris's death would not be final, not truly. But Zol would not remain with him on Mars. He sought richer feeding grounds elsewhere in the system, and a place where proof of majesty might be forged. We do not know if this was what specifically compelled Zol to flee to Io, but we do know that when Zol's spirit arrived, it gained some degree of control over the local Taken, who infest Io's surface and much of its depths. As is ever the case, the Taken are drawn with their cacophonous chittering and slathering jaws to the light of the Traveler. Their hunger drives them to congregate in great numbers on Io, as it was the last place that the Traveler touched in Sol and is brimming with the Traveler's light. Deep beneath the lost oasis, the spirit of Zol took root and began to fester. Zol knew what it had seen in its own death. It had seen the promise of a being who would embody the sword logic and would become a strong tribute in its name. It had seen you, the Kingslayer, the breaker of dynasties, the true god of Mars. And so, knowing what it would bind itself to, it whispered and did as was its nature. In those whispers, it bargained. The whispers drew guardians to Io, to the lost oasis and the great Taken infestation that arose from that place. You were one such guardian who answered the call. But with your arrival and your descent into the underworld beneath the grove of Ulan Tan, suddenly, The whispers grew louder. You had heard the voice of Zol before. You knew what it was that awaited you down below. The spirit of a being you had vanquished and who had yet persisted onwards. A being of power beyond your own imagining. And so the whispers led you on. And so you followed.
You shall drift. There is no light here. You shall drown in the deep.
Those words, "You shall drift, you shall drown in the deep," they were not a threat. They were a promise. For the deep here was not an invitation to death and decimation. The deep here was a promise of power, and to embrace it, to ingratiate oneself with the will of thousands, would be to see the sword logic of the deep cut through the universe itself. Thus you would find yourself facing Zol's true force, a horde of Taken beneath the lost oasis. Proving your power against these fiends would be difficult. You would need to navigate Io's labyrinthine passageways and counter the enraged Taken where you found them. But those that emerged victorious from this trial found that a tool of devastation had been delivered unto them. They would discover the Whisper of the Worm. Weapons of a similar nature to this had been seen before. Those that defeated the great trials of Oryx's children had claimed relics just like these in the past. The Black Hammer of Crota, or the Black Spindle of Uranuk and Halak. They had brought a similar degree of devastation to the world before, and their challenges had also required precious time to be spent dealing with Taken combatants, or a very god itself to be brought to heel and destroyed through the logic of the sword. Now you had trodden that same path leading to Zol, and Zol's very essence was carved into a weapon that would embody the promise of the sword logic. Strangely enough, this was not the first time a weapon had been created in such a manner. Oryx had foreseen the possibility that he too might die to a being that was more powerful than he. It was for this reason that he crafted the calcified fragments and filled them with the verses of his Books of Sorrow, a book which would inform the reader of Oryx's being, his very spirit, his very nature. A book that would lead them to the designs of a weapon known as the Touch of Malice. By using this weapon, the wielder would embody Oryx, even being forced to use his own ravenous heart as its core, embodying his hunger for their own ends. Thus Oryx would live on. Thus the sword logic would be proven, and thus in his own small way, Oryx would still be a part of it. It was in this same vein that Zol allowed his spirit to enter into the weapon we would come to know as the Whisper of the Worm. But where Oryx invited his usurpers on a path towards destruction so that they might prove themselves by the laws of the sword logic, Zol granted the power instead through bargaining. The Whisper of the Worm is, in this way, one with its guardian through more than a simple relationship of weapon to warrior. There is a symbiosis in this merging, a pact, a promise. And so it was that Zol, the Will of Thousands, perished, but was not destroyed. For death is a road. Death is a metamorphosis. It is the unsacred union between destroyer and destroyed. Just as hive swords link victim to wielder, Zol is linked to you from life into death through the Whisper of the Worm. As Zol craved the sword logic, he saw you as its herald. He saw you as a feeding ground. He would be the parasite that would attach to you. Your power would make for a banquet for this worm god. But in his new form, Zol was more than simply a parasite. He would provide some benefit to his host. His teeth were sharper than yours, and in being wielded by you, he could be something more. For you, this may be a weapon, but for your foes it is more than this. It is a test of their right to exist. In wielding the Whisper of the Worm, you test the power of each being that you slay with it, and in that test, you worship Xol's majesty, the majesty of the sword logic, and of that final shape that shall arise from it. In this, you will become one. In becoming the Whisper of the Worm, Xol has become a part of the law and the rule of the sword logic. He is now not the wielder, but the scythe that cleaves the wheat from the chaff. He is the blade that cuts the weak from the strong. He is the rule that divides the mighty living from the mighty dead. In return for this worship, we receive the power that is our right, the power gained from conquest. With the Whisper at our side, we would be able to dominate the objective universe with our subjective will. We exert our right to persist by the right of violence. And as Xol feasted on that sweet logic of existence asserted by violence, the Worm, our god, was pleased. But a word of warning: wield this weapon with care. Whenever you use it against our foes, you are putting yourself up in a wager of sorts. By using this weapon, you ask them a simple question: is the sum of your greatness enough to eclipse my own? Should the answer be no, then you shall go on. You shall consume their being, and both you and Xol will grow more powerful by the hive's twisted logic, darkness infused, and unbroken like the last knife before the universe's end. But should they meet the challenge and overcome it, beware. A sword can cut both ways, and Xol has abandoned those that it bargained with before. Be swift and true in responding to such challenges, or you shall find yourself within the hungry maw of the worm's logic. That's all from me for now, though. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like, and let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. It's been a long time since we've talked about the lore of the Whisper of the Worm, and it's really nice to return to it, using both old and new Whisper footage for that matter. With that in mind, I hope you understand why it took a few days to get this out there, because from the very reveal stream I heard that there was at least a little new dialogue, and so I wanted to capture all of it for you. That being said, I hope you enjoyed the video regardless, and even if you didn't leave a comment or didn't like, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me. And that in the meantime, my name is Byf. Rhodacia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.